rainforests cover approximately 6% of the Earth's land surface today, a figure that sounds modest until one considers that this relatively small fraction of terrestrial area contains more than half of all known plant and animal species, cycles water vapour at scales that influence weather patterns across entire continents, and stores carbon in quantities that profoundly affect the composition of the global atmosphere. The term rainforest itself emerged in the late 19th century from German botanical literature, when researchers attempting to classify the world's vegetation zones needed a way to distinguish the wet, warm, evergreen forests of equatorial regions from the temperate forests of Europe and North America, which experience pronounced seasonal variation and periodic leaf fall. The German botanist Andreas Schimper formalized the concept in his 1898 work on plant geography, describing what he called Regenwald as a formation characterized by year-round warmth, consistent moisture availability, and a distinctive layered structure of plant communities. This systematic classification reflected the broader scientific project of the 19th century, which sought to organize the natural world into comprehensible categories even as colonial expansion was bringing Europeans into direct contact with tropical environments on an unprecedented scale. The distribution of rainforests across the globe follows patterns determined by the interaction of atmospheric circulation, ocean currents, continental geography, and geological history extending back tens of millions of years. The largest continuous expanse of tropical rainforest occupies the Amazon basin of South America, covering an area of roughly 5.5 million square kilometers, though precise measurements vary depending on how the boundaries are defined and which satellite data sources are used. This Amazonian forest developed its current form over approximately 55 million years, following the separation of South America from Africa and the gradual northward movement of the continent toward its present position. During this immense span of time, the Amazon basin experienced repeated climatic fluctuations, including periods during the Pleistocene when drier conditions may have caused the forest to contract into refugia, separated by grassland or savanna, though this refugia hypothesis remains debated among paleoecologists who interpret the available pollen records and sediment cores differently. What is less disputed is that the Amazon forest has served as an evolutionary crucible, generating much of the extraordinary biological diversity that now characterizes the neotropics through processes of speciation, adaptation, and ecological differentiation that unfolded over geological timescales. The second major block of tropical rainforest stretches across Central Africa, centered on the Congo Basin, which at approximately 2 million square kilometers represents the second largest contiguous tropical forest on Earth. This forest shares a common ancestry with the Amazon forest through the ancient supercontinent of Gondwana, but the subsequent geological and climatic histories of the two regions diverged in ways that produced distinctly different biological communities. The Congo Basin forest experienced its own cycles of expansion and contraction during glacial and interglacial periods, and the Great African Rift Valley system created barriers to species dispersal that influenced evolutionary patterns across the continent. The third major concentration of tropical rainforest occurs in Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific region, fragmentary compared to the Amazon or Congo because it is distributed across the islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, New Guinea, and portions of mainland Southeast Asia. This archipelagic distribution reflects the complex geological history of the region, where tectonic plate movements, volcanic activity, and fluctuating sea levels during glacial periods repeatedly connected and separated landmasses, creating what biogeographers call Wallace's Line and other boundaries that mark transitions between different faunal realms. Beyond these three primary centres, smaller rainforest areas persist in eastern Madagascar, the Atlantic coast of Brazil, the Caribbean, Central America, the Pacific coast of Colombia and Ecuador, and scattered patches across tropical Australia, each with its own distinctive species assemblages shaped by unique regional histories. The total global extent of tropical rainforest has declined substantially from historical baselines, with estimates suggesting that perhaps 15 to 17 million square kilometers existed before large-scale human modification began, meaning that contemporary forest represents somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the original extent. However, establishing precise historical baselines proves difficult because the archaeological and paleo-ecological evidence for prehistoric human impacts on forest cover remains contested, particularly regarding the degree to which indigenous land use practices over thousands of years may have shaped forest composition and extent before European colonial expansion. The physical structure of a tropical rainforest reflects the continuous competitive struggle for access to light, which serves as the primary limiting resource in an environment where water and warmth remain available year-round. The canopy layer, typically reaching 30 to 40 meters in height, captures the vast majority of incoming solar radiation, creating a shaded understory where light intensity may fall to less than 2% of full sunlight. Trees in this upper layer often develop broad, flat crowns that maximize the surface area exposed to the sun, and their leaves tend to possess a characteristic drip-tip shape that facilitates rapid water shedding during heavy rainfall. Emergent trees exceed even the main canopy height, sometimes reaching 60 meters or more, their crowns projecting above the continuous green ceiling where they experience higher wind exposure, temperature extremes, and direct sunlight intensity compared to trees embedded within the main canopy. The tallest tropical tree yet measured, a specimen of the species Shorea fagetiana discovered in Malaysian Borneo in 2019, reached approximately 100.8 meters, comparable to the tallest temperate conifers, though employing entirely different architectural strategies. Beneath the main canopy, a sub-canopy layer contains smaller trees, immature individuals of canopy species, and shade-tolerant species adapted to the lower light conditions. The shrub layer below this contains woody plants rarely exceeding a few meters in height, and the herb layer occupies the forest floor with ferns, seedlings, and herbaceous plants capable of completing their life cycles under extremely limited light. This stratified structure means that a single hectare of tropical rainforest may contain more vertical habitat complexity than a temperate forest covering many times the area, and species have evolved to exploit specific strata, creating communities of canopy specialists, understory specialists, and forest floor specialists that rarely interact directly despite living in the same geographic location. Lianas, the woody climbing plants that use trees as structural support to reach the canopy without investing in self-supporting trunks, can constitute up to 25% of the woody plant stems in some tropical forests, creating interconnected pathways through the canopy that animals use for travel and that influence forest dynamics in ways researchers are still working to understand. The soil beneath tropical rainforests often surprises those expecting that such productive ecosystems must arise from exceptionally fertile ground. In fact, many tropical forest soils, particularly the highly weathered oxysols and ultisols that dominate ancient tropical landscapes, rank among the least fertile on Earth when measured by conventional agricultural metrics of nutrient availability. Millions of years of leaching by heavy rainfall have stripped these soils of most soluble mineral nutrients, leaving iron and aluminum oxides that give the soil its characteristic red or yellow coloration but provide little plant nutrition. The resolution of this apparent paradox lies in understanding that tropical rainforests have evolved to operate as nearly closed nutrient cycles, where the vast majority of essential elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium exist not in the soil but in living biomass and the thin layer of decomposing organic matter on the forest surface. When leaves fall, branches break, or animals die, a diverse community of decomposers including fungi, bacteria, termites, and other invertebrates rapidly breaks down organic matter and releases nutrients that living roots reabsorb before leaching can carry them beyond reach. This tight coupling between decomposition and nutrient uptake depends on the dense network of fine roots and associated mycorrhizal fungi that permeate the upper soil layers. Mycorrhizal associations, in which fungal hyphae extend the effective absorptive surface of plant roots and facilitate nutrient transfer in exchange for carbon compounds from photosynthesis, occur in virtually all tropical forest trees and prove essential for phosphorus acquisition in the nutrient-poor conditions typical of ancient tropical soils. The efficiency of this nutrient cycling means that despite low soil fertility, tropical rainforests achieve net primary productivity rates, among the highest of any terrestrial ecosystem, with mature forests fixing roughly 2 to 3 kilograms of carbon per square meter per year, though this productivity is largely balanced by respiration and decomposition, such that old-growth tropical forests are typically near carbon equilibrium rather than serving as major carbon sinks. The carbon sink function of tropical forests derives primarily from the massive standing stock of carbon already stored in living woody biomass and soil organic matter, rather than from ongoing net accumulation, though young secondary forests regenerating after disturbance can sequester substantial amounts of atmospheric carbon during their growth phase. The biodiversity of tropical rainforests has fascinated and puzzled naturalists since the earliest European expeditions to equatorial regions returned with collections of specimens vastly exceeding the species richness of temperate zones. The British naturalist Henry Walter Bates spent 11 years in the Amazon, from 1848 to 1859, and collected over 14,000 species, more than 8,000 of which were new to science, a productivity that illustrated both the intensity of his efforts and the sheer number of species awaiting discovery. This pattern of high species richness in tropical regions compared to higher latitudes, known as the latitudinal diversity gradient, represents one of the most consistent patterns in ecology, observed across virtually all major taxonomic groups from insects to mammals to trees, yet its underlying causes remain debated despite more than a century of research and the proposal of dozens of hypotheses. Some explanations emphasize the greater area of tropical regions over geological time, arguing that larger areas support larger populations less prone to extinction and provide more opportunity for geographic isolation and speciation. Others focus on the greater energy and productivity available in warm, wet climates, suggesting that more resources can support more species by allowing finer niche subdivision or by reducing the intensity of competition. Still, other hypotheses emphasize the longer period of relatively stable climate that tropical regions experience compared to temperate zones, which were repeatedly disrupted by glacial advances that caused widespread extinction and prevented the accumulation of species diversity over time. The climatic stability hypothesis gains support from the observation that many tropical species have relatively narrow environmental tolerances and would be poorly equipped to survive the climatic fluctuations that characterize higher latitudes. But critics note that tropical climates were not uniformly stable during the Pleistocene, and that the refugia hypothesis implies substantial forest fragmentation, even in the Amazon during glacial periods. A more recent synthesis proposes that multiple mechanisms likely operate simultaneously and reinforce each other, with the high energy and productivity of tropical environments accelerating speciation rates, the relative climatic stability reducing extinction rates, and the accumulated diversity itself creating ecological opportunities that further promote diversification through co-evolutionary interactions between species. The number of tree species in a single hectare of tropical rainforest can exceed the total tree species count for all of temperate Europe or eastern North America, with plots in the western Amazon or on the island of Borneo sometimes containing 300 or more tree species per hectare compared to perhaps 20 or 30 species in comparable temperate forest plots. This extraordinary local diversity creates practical challenges for forest inventory and management, as identifying tropical trees requires specialized botanical knowledge that remains scarce even in countries with extensive forest resources. A study published in 2022 estimated that approximately 73,000 tree species exist globally, with more than half occurring in tropical rainforests, and projected that perhaps 9,000 tree species remain unknown to science, with the majority likely to be found in tropical regions, particularly in areas that have received less botanical attention, such as the Amazon basin, New Guinea, and Central Africa. However, discovering and formally describing new species represents only one dimension of understanding tropical forest diversity, as even named species often remain poorly known in terms of their ecological requirements, population dynamics, geographic distributions, and interactions with other species. Insects constitute the overwhelming majority of animal species in tropical rainforests, and the true extent of insect diversity remains far more uncertain than plant diversity, because comprehensive inventories are difficult and expensive to conduct. The entomologist Terry Irwin's famous 1982 paper, which estimated 30 million insect species globally based on beetle diversity in tropical tree canopies, helped spark renewed interest in tropical biodiversity research but also illustrated the enormous uncertainty involved in such extrapolations. Subsequent estimates have ranged from fewer than 5 million to more than 20 million insect species, with most recent analyses converging on figures of 5 to 8 million, of which perhaps 1 to 2 million have been formally described. The vast majority of these species occur in tropical forests, where the structural complexity of the vegetation, the year-round warmth that permits continuous activity, and the diversity of plant hosts and food resources support insect communities of staggering complexity. A single tree crown in a tropical forest may harbour hundreds of insect species, including specialists that feed only on that particular tree species, as well as generalists that occur across many hosts, and the interactions among insects, plants, fungi, and other organisms create ecological networks whose structure scientists are only beginning to map. Vertebrate diversity in tropical rainforests follows the same latitudinal pattern as insects and plants, with tropical regions supporting far more species of birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians than equivalent areas at higher latitudes. The Amazon basin alone contains over 1,300 bird species, compared to approximately 800 for all of North America, and new species continue to be discovered with surprising regularity through targeted field surveys and genetic analysis of museum specimens. Primate diversity concentrates heavily in tropical forests, with the major radiation of primates having occurred in tropical environments and relatively few species having adapted to temperate conditions. The tropical forests of Africa, Asia, and the Americas each harbour their own distinctive primate faunas that evolved largely in isolation after the continents separated, producing parallel adaptations to similar ecological niches such as the leaf-eating columbine monkeys of Africa and Asia, and the howler monkeys of the Americas, or the small-bodied nocturnal galagos of Africa and lorises of Asia, and the tarsiers of Southeast Asia and the owl monkeys of South America. Amphibian diversity reaches its peak in the wet tropics, where the combination of warmth and moisture creates ideal conditions for animals that typically require water or at least very humid conditions for reproduction and respiration through permeable skin. The cloud forests of Central America and the Andes, the Atlantic forest of Brazil, and the mountains of Madagascar harbour exceptional concentrations of endemic amphibian species, many of which remain undescribed or are known from only a few specimens. Unfortunately, tropical amphibians have also suffered disproportionately from the chytrid fungus disease that has caused population declines and extinctions worldwide since the late 20th century, with some estimates suggesting that chytridomycosis has contributed to the decline of more than 500 amphibian species and the likely extinction of at least 90. This disease exemplifies the vulnerabilities of tropical rainforest species more broadly, as many exist in small geographic ranges, occur at low population densities, have specialized ecological requirements, and possess limited ability to disperse to new locations if conditions in their current range become unsuitable. The ecological interactions that structure tropical rainforest communities differ in important ways from those in temperate ecosystems, though distinguishing general patterns from regional variation remains an active area of research. Herbivore pressure appears to be more intense in tropical forests, with a larger proportion of plant production consumed by herbivorous insects, and the evolution of more elaborate chemical and physical defences in tropical plants compared to their temperate relatives. The defensive compounds produced by tropical plants, including alkaloids, terpenes, phenolics, and thousands of other secondary metabolites, represent a vast reservoir of chemical diversity that has attracted pharmaceutical interest, as many important drugs derive from compounds originally discovered in tropical forest plants. However, the process of bioprospecting, by which companies and researchers screen tropical organisms for potentially valuable compounds, has raised complex issues regarding intellectual property, benefit sharing with indigenous communities and source countries, and the practical challenges of converting initial discoveries into commercially viable products given the length and expense of drug development pipelines. Pollination and seed dispersal relationships in tropical rainforests often involve specialized mutualisms between plants and animals that contrast with the more generalized pollination systems typical of temperate regions. Many tropical trees depend on specific groups of pollinators, including bats, birds, large bees, moths, or other insects, and have evolved flowers with characteristics matched to their pollinators' sensory capabilities and foraging behaviours. Bat-pollinated flowers tend to open at night, produce strong musty odours, and offer abundant nectar in sturdy structures that can accommodate the weight of a visiting bat. While bird-pollinated flowers often display red or orange colours that attract avian visitors but are less visible to many insects. The fig family, which includes more than 800 species distributed primarily in tropical and subtropical regions, exhibits one of the most remarkable pollination mutualisms known, involving species-specific associations with tiny wasps that develop inside the fig fruit and transfer pollen between trees of the same species. Each fig species typically associates with a single wasp species, and the evolutionary diversification of figs and their wasps appears to have proceeded in tandem over tens of millions of years, creating a system whose stability depends on both partners maintaining their co-evolved relationship. Seed dispersal in tropical forests similarly involves a diverse community of animal dispersers, including fruit-eating birds, bats, primates, rodents, and even fish that consume fallen fruits in seasonally flooded forests. The loss of large-bodied seed dispersers, which has occurred in many tropical regions due to hunting pressure and habitat fragmentation, can alter forest composition over time as the seeds of certain tree species fail to reach suitable germination sites or suffer increased predation when not transported away from parent trees. Research in the Atlantic forest of Brazil has documented shifts in tree species composition in forest fragments where large frugivores have disappeared, with a gradual increase in tree species with small seeds dispersed by small birds at the expense of species with large seeds that formerly depended on large-bodied dispersers like tapirs, peccaries, and large primates. These changes unfold slowly over decades and centuries, meaning that even forest fragments that superficially appear intact may be undergoing cryptic shifts in composition that will eventually alter their structure and function. The role of tropical rainforests in the global climate system extends far beyond their function as carbon stores, encompassing complex interactions with the hydrological cycle that influence weather patterns at local, regional, and continental scales. A mature tropical rainforest can transpire enormous quantities of water vapour into the atmosphere, with some estimates suggesting that the Amazon forest returns approximately half of the rainfall it receives back to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration. This recycled moisture contributes to rainfall downwind, creating a phenomenon sometimes described as a biotic pump, in which the forest itself helps maintain the precipitation regime on which it depends. The practical implications of this feedback mechanism became clearer through research beginning in the 1970s that used computer models to simulate how deforestation might affect regional climate, with early results suggesting that removing the Amazon forest could reduce rainfall by 20 to 30% and potentially trigger a shift toward a drier climate state that would not support rainforest regeneration even if deforestation ceased. More recent modelling work has refined these estimates and highlighted the existence of potential tipping points beyond which forest dieback could become self-reinforcing, though considerable uncertainty remains about the precise thresholds and the timescales over which such transitions might occur. The concept of a tipping point implies that deforestation below some threshold level might be reversible, with the remaining forest maintaining sufficient precipitation to permit recovery, while deforestation beyond the threshold would trigger a cascade of further forest loss even without additional human clearing. Current estimates place this threshold somewhere between 20 and 40% forest loss for the Amazon basin as a whole, with some researchers arguing that the eastern and southern portions of the basin may already be approaching critical levels. However, other scientists caution that the modelling evidence remains preliminary and that the complex feedbacks among forest cover, precipitation, fire frequency, and climate variability are not yet well enough understood to make confident predictions about future trajectories. The influence of tropical forests on global climate operates through multiple pathways beyond carbon storage and the hydrological cycle. The emission of volatile organic compounds from tropical forest vegetation affects atmospheric chemistry, contributing to the formation of secondary organic aerosols that influence cloud formation and radiative balance. These biogenic emissions include isoprene, monoterpenes, and numerous other compounds that participate in complex photochemical reactions and whose effects on climate represent an area of active research. The colour and texture of forest canopies affect the absorption and reflection of solar radiation, with intact forests generally absorbing more solar energy than cleared land covered with pasture or crops, which tends to be more reflective. When this absorbed energy is released as latent heat through evapotranspiration rather than as sensible heat that warms the air directly, the cooling effect of forest transpiration can result in local and regional temperatures several degrees lower in forested areas compared to adjacent cleared land. The biogeochemical cycling of nutrients through tropical forest ecosystems connects terrestrial processes to ocean productivity through river discharge that carries dissolved and particulate organic matter, nitrogen, phosphorus, and trace elements to coastal and marine environments. The Amazon River alone delivers approximately 20% of all fresh water entering the world's oceans, along with massive loads of sediment and dissolved nutrients that support productive fisheries and influence marine chemistry over extensive areas. The Congo River similarly represents a major conduit of materials from Central African forests to the Atlantic Ocean, and the nutrient dynamics of these river systems both reflect conditions in their forested catchments and would change substantially if land cover transformation altered the sources and transport of water and sediments. Human relationships with tropical rainforests extend back tens of thousands of years, encompassing a diversity of subsistence strategies, cultural adaptations, and land management practices that shaped forest composition and structure long before the period of European colonial expansion. Archaeological evidence from the Amazon basin has increasingly challenged earlier assumptions that tropical forests were pristine wildernesses inhabited by small, scattered populations with minimal environmental impact. Research over the past 3 decades has documented extensive anthropogenic modifications, including terra preta, the dark fertile soils created through the intentional addition of charcoal, organic matter, and nutrients that occur at archaeological sites throughout Amazonia, and indicate sophisticated management of soil fertility over centuries or millennia. The distribution and properties of terra preta soil suggest that pre-Columbian populations manipulated soil chemistry to sustain agricultural productivity in an environment otherwise characterized by nutrient-poor soils, and that some of these modified soils remained more fertile than surrounding natural soils, even 500 years after the populations that created them had collapsed following European contact. The extent of pre-Columbian forest modification in Amazonia remains debated, with some researchers arguing for populations numbering in the millions and extensive landscape transformation, while others maintain that the evidence supports more modest populations concentrated in riverine areas, and that the interfluvial forest remained largely unmodified. These debates have significant implications for understanding what baseline conditions should inform conservation goals, as the recognition that current forests may reflect centuries of recovery from past human impacts complicates assumptions about naturalness and ecological equilibrium. Similar debates occur regarding other tropical forest regions, including Central Africa, where the expansion of Bantu-speaking agriculturalists over the past few thousand years appears to have modified forest savanna boundaries and species composition, and Southeast Asia, where archaeological evidence documents human presence in tropical forest environments extending back at least 40,000 years with varying degrees of environmental modification over time. The arrival of Europeans in the tropics initiated a new phase in the history of human-forest relationships, characterized by the integration of tropical forest products into global trading networks and the expansion of commercial extraction at scales previously unknown. The colonial encounter brought tropical rainforests into direct contact with European economic demands, scientific curiosity, and administrative ambitions in ways that transformed both the forests and the societies inhabiting them. The extraction of forest products for export, including dyes, resins, gums, medicinal plants, and timber, provided the initial economic rationale for colonial engagement with tropical forests, followed in many regions by the clearance of forest land for plantation agriculture, producing crops demanded by European and later North American consumers. Rubber extraction in the Amazon during the late 19th century exemplifies both the integration of tropical forests into global commodity chains and the social transformations this integration entailed, as the rubber boom drew indigenous and migrant workers into debt peonage arrangements and concentrated wealth in the hands of a small elite while devastating indigenous communities through disease, forced labour, and territorial displacement. The ecological consequences of colonial-era extraction varied considerably depending on the product, the extraction methods, and the intensity and duration of exploitation. Some extractive activities proved relatively sustainable when conducted at low intensities, as the harvest of Brazil nuts, acai palm fruits, or latex from living rubber trees could permit forest persistence if extraction levels remained within the regenerative capacity of the exploited populations. Other activities, particularly timber extraction focused on commercially valuable species, could alter forest composition even when the overall forest cover remained intact. As selective logging removed the largest and most valuable trees and often damaged surrounding vegetation during felling and extraction operations. The cascading effects of selective logging on forest structure, microclimate, and species composition have been documented through long-term research plots in multiple tropical regions, showing that logged forests can take decades to centuries to recover structural characteristics similar to unlogged reference areas, and that some aspects of species composition and ecological function may never fully recover in the absence of active restoration interventions. The conversion of tropical forest to agricultural land has historically represented the most significant direct driver of forest loss, though the forms of agriculture and the circumstances of conversion have varied enormously across regions and periods. Shifting cultivation, also known as swidden or slash-and-burn agriculture, represents a traditional form of land use in which forest is cleared, cultivated for a few seasons until soil fertility declines, and then left to regenerate during a fallow period while cultivation moves to a new plot. This system can maintain forest cover over the landscape. When fallow periods are sufficiently long for secondary forest to develop, population densities remain low enough that each plot receives adequate recovery time, and the fire used to clear vegetation does not escape into surrounding primary forest. However, increasing population pressure, reduced access to land, and integration into market economies have shortened fallow periods in many regions, potentially leading to degraded fallows that fail to restore soil fertility or biodiversity to levels approaching those of mature forest. The expansion of permanent agriculture, particularly for commodity crops destined for export markets, has driven deforestation at far larger scales than traditional shifting cultivation. The Brazilian Amazon experienced massive deforestation during the 1970s and 1980s, following the construction of new roads that opened previously inaccessible areas to colonization and cattle ranching, with annual forest loss peaking at approximately 2.8 million hectares in 1995 before declining significantly during the 2000s due to a combination of strengthened law enforcement, market-based initiatives, and changes in economic conditions. The subsequent partial reversal of this decline in the late 2010s and early 2020s illustrated both the progress that had been achieved and its fragility in the face of shifting political priorities and enforcement capacity. Soy production expanded rapidly across the Amazon and Cerrado regions during the early 2000s, before a voluntary moratorium adopted by major soy traders in 2006 redirected soy expansion largely away from forested lands, demonstrating that supply chain interventions could influence land use outcomes, but also raising questions about displacement effects as deforestation pressure potentially shifted to other crops or regions not covered by similar agreements. Palm oil production has emerged as a dominant driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia and Malaysia, where the expansion of oil palm plantations has converted millions of hectares of lowland rainforest and peat swamp forest since the 1990s. The economics of palm oil production make it one of the most profitable agricultural land uses in the tropics, with yields per hectare far exceeding other oilseed crops in demand driven by its versatility in food processing, personal care products, and increasingly biofuel applications. Attempts to improve the sustainability of palm oil production through certification schemes, particularly the Round Table on Sustainable Palm Oil established in 2004, have faced criticism both from environmental groups who argue the standards are insufficiently stringent and from producers who face costs and barriers in meeting certification requirements. The effectiveness of certification in reducing deforestation remains contested, with some studies finding reduced forest loss on certified concessions, while others document continued clearing and question whether certification affects the total area planted or merely distinguishes among production methods. The peat forests of Indonesia represent a particularly consequential case because peat deposits accumulate carbon over thousands of years and, when drained for plantation development, release that stored carbon through decomposition and fire. Indonesian peatlands contain an estimated 50 to 60 billion metric tons of carbon, and drainage followed by fire has made Indonesia one of the world's largest greenhouse gas emitters during severe fire years, with the 2015 fires releasing emissions estimated at over 1.5 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, equivalent over a period of a few months. The government of Indonesia subsequently implemented restrictions on peat drainage and plantation development, though enforcement capacity and effectiveness vary considerably across the extensive and remote peatland areas. The interaction between drainage, fire, and climate variability creates potential for positive feedbacks in which drier conditions increase fire risk. Fire further degrades peat and forest, and degradation increases future fire vulnerability, raising concerns about irreversible transitions in some peatland areas. The causes of tropical deforestation operate through complex chains of proximate and underlying factors that researchers have attempted to disentangle through both statistical analyses and in-depth case studies. Proximate causes include the specific activities that directly remove forest cover, such as agricultural expansion, logging, infrastructure development, and fire, while underlying causes encompass the economic incentives, policies, institutions, demographic trends, and cultural factors that shape decisions about land use. The relative importance of different causes varies across regions and time periods, with cattle ranching dominating as a proximate cause in the Brazilian Amazon, while smallholder agriculture plays a larger role in parts of Africa, and shifting cultivation remains significant in some Southeast Asian contexts. Market prices for agricultural commodities influence deforestation rates through effects on the profitability of forest conversion, as documented by studies showing correlations between commodity prices and subsequent clearing, though the relationship is mediated by many other factors, including property rights, access to credit, infrastructure availability, and law enforcement. The role of roads in facilitating deforestation has received particular attention because road construction both directly converts forest to non-forest and induces subsequent clearing along road corridors as access improves and land values increase. Statistical analyses of deforestation patterns in the Amazon have found that the vast majority of clearing occurs within a few kilometers of existing roads, and that new road construction can be predicted to trigger additional deforestation in surrounding areas. This relationship has informed debates about infrastructure planning in tropical forest regions, with some analysts arguing for strategic placement of roads to avoid the most ecologically or climatically sensitive areas, and others questioning whether planned road placement can effectively contain subsequent development pressures. The experience of the paving of the BR-163 highway connecting the Amazon to southern Brazil illustrated both the potential for road improvements to accelerate deforestation and the possibility that governance interventions, including protected area creation and enhanced law enforcement, could moderate the expected impacts. The political economy of tropical deforestation involves the distribution of costs and benefits from forest conversion across different groups, including local communities, national elites, domestic urban consumers, and international markets. Those who benefit from forest clearing, whether large landowners, agricultural companies, or smallholder farmers, often wield political influence that exceeds their numbers and can shape policies regarding land tenure, infrastructure investment, environmental regulation, and enforcement. The costs of deforestation, including lost ecosystem services, biodiversity loss, and climate impacts, are often diffuse, delayed, or borne by populations with limited political voice, creating asymmetries that favour continued clearing in the absence of countervailing forces. International demand for commodities produced on deforested land connects consumers in wealthy countries to deforestation in tropical producing regions, though the attenuation of this connection through complex supply chains can obscure the relationship and complicate efforts to use consumer pressure to influence producer behaviour. Protected areas represent one of the primary policy tools for preventing deforestation and conserving tropical forest biodiversity, with approximately 17% of the world's land area now falling within some category of protected status. The effectiveness of protected areas in reducing deforestation depends heavily on their design, management, and the broader governance context in which they operate. Some protected areas experience rates of forest loss comparable to or even exceeding those in surrounding unprotected lands, particularly when they exist only as lines on maps without effective on-the-ground management, or when they face intense pressure from surrounding development. Other protected areas demonstrate measurably lower deforestation rates even when surrounded by active forest frontiers, suggesting that protection can work when supported by adequate resources, institutional capacity, and political commitment. Indigenous territories and community-managed forests in some regions have demonstrated deforestation rates comparable to or lower than strictly protected areas, leading to increased attention to community-based conservation approaches that recognise indigenous and local rights while maintaining forest cover. The economics of conservation has generated extensive research on mechanisms that might shift incentives toward forest maintenance, including payments for ecosystem services programs that compensate landholders for foregone development opportunities. These programs have been implemented at various scales, from local watershed protection schemes paying farmers to maintain forest cover near water supplies, to national programs like Costa Rica's Payment for Environmental Services system established in 1996, to international initiatives like the REDD+ framework under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change that seeks to provide financial incentives for developing countries to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. The effectiveness and efficiency of payment schemes in generating additional conservation beyond what would have occurred anyway remain subjects of research and debate, as does the challenge of ensuring that payments reach those whose behaviour most needs to change, and that monitoring systems can reliably verify compliance. The science of tropical forest ecology has advanced substantially since the mid-20th century through the establishment of long-term research sites, the development of new technologies, and growing international collaboration among researchers from tropical and temperate countries. The Forest Dynamics Plots Network, which originated with the establishment of a 50-hectare permanent plot on Barra Colorado Island in Panama in 1982, now encompasses more than 70 large-scale plots across tropical, subtropical, and temperate regions where every tree above a minimum diameter is identified, mapped, measured, and tracked through repeated censuses. Data from these plots have enabled analyses of tree demography, species coexistence, forest responses to climate variation, and other fundamental questions that would be impossible to address without standardized long-term monitoring across multiple sites. The integration of ground-based measurements with remote sensing data from satellites and aircraft has permitted analyses at larger spatial scales, including mapping of forest cover change, estimation of above-ground biomass, and detection of logging and fire disturbance across entire countries or regions. Advances in genetic analysis have transformed understanding of tropical forest organisms, enabling species identification through DNA barcoding. When morphological identification proves difficult, reconstruction of evolutionary relationships among species, analysis of population genetic structure and gene flow, and investigation of the microbiome communities associated with tropical plants and animals. Environmental DNA techniques that detect genetic material shed by organisms into their surroundings have begun to enable biodiversity surveys without the need to capture or directly observe target species, potentially allowing monitoring of cryptic or rare species that would be difficult to detect through traditional methods. However, the application of these advanced techniques in tropical regions faces challenges including limited research infrastructure, the expense of genetic analyses, gaps in reference databases for species identification, and the need for training and capacity building to enable researchers and managers in tropical countries to deploy these tools independently. Climate change adds a new dimension of uncertainty and concern to the future of tropical rainforests, as warming temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, and increased atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations interact with direct human pressures in complex ways. Observational evidence indicates that tropical forests have already responded to recent climate change, with increased tree mortality in some regions during drought years and shifts in the timing of flowering and fruiting that may affect plant-animal interactions. The severe drought that affected the Amazon in 2010, and again in 2015 to 2016, provided natural experiments documenting how extreme events can trigger widespread tree mortality and transition large areas from carbon sinks to carbon sources as dead biomass decomposes and releases stored carbon. The combination of drought stress and increased temperatures can exceed the physiological tolerances of many tropical tree species, and rising vapor pressure deficits under warming can accelerate plant water loss and potentially cause hydraulic failure even when soil moisture remains available. The future trajectory of tropical forests under climate change depends on the magnitude and pace of warming, the response of precipitation to climate forcing, the ability of forest species to adapt or migrate in response to changing conditions, and the interactions between climate impacts and other stressors. Climate models project continued warming in tropical regions under all emission scenarios, though projections of future precipitation patterns in the tropics remain uncertain, with different models producing divergent results for key regions including the Amazon. The CO2 fertilization effect, by which elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations can increase plant photosynthesis and potentially offset some negative impacts of warming and drought, represents a major uncertainty in projecting future forest dynamics. Experimental evidence from CO2 enrichment studies shows that tropical forests can increase productivity under elevated CO2 in the short term, but nutrient limitations, especially phosphorus availability on old tropical soils, may constrain long-term responses and prevent the large carbon uptake increases that some models predict. The potential for tropical forests to experience rapid, potentially irreversible transitions under the combined pressures of climate change and direct human impacts has emerged as a significant concern in the scientific literature and in policy discussions. The concept of ecological tipping points, where gradual changes in drivers can trigger abrupt shifts in ecosystem state, applies to tropical forests through several proposed mechanisms including forest rainfall feedbacks, fire vegetation feedbacks, and threshold responses of tree physiology to climate extremes. If realized, such transitions could convert large areas of closed canopy rainforest to open woodland, savanna, or degraded scrub, with major consequences for biodiversity, carbon storage, and the livelihoods of populations that depend on forest resources and services. However, the empirical evidence for imminent tipping points remains contested, with some researchers arguing that the available data support concerns about approaching thresholds, while others maintain that model predictions are too uncertain to justify claims of specific risk levels. The restoration of degraded tropical forests and the reforestation of cleared lands have received increasing attention as potential strategies for addressing both biodiversity loss and climate change. Natural regeneration can proceed rapidly on abandoned agricultural lands in tropical regions when seed sources remain available and soil conditions have not been too severely degraded, with some studies documenting recovery of substantial forest structure and species richness within a few decades of abandonment. However, the composition of naturally regenerating forests often differs from that of old-growth forest, with a higher proportion of pioneer species adapted to disturbed conditions and potentially slower recovery of species characteristic of mature forest. Active restoration through tree planting can accelerate recovery of forest structure and may be necessary when natural seed dispersal is limited due to isolation from forest remnants or the absence of animal dispersers, though planting programs face challenges in selecting appropriate species mixes, sourcing sufficient quantities of high-quality seeds, and ensuring survival and growth of planted seedlings. The potential of tropical forest restoration to contribute to climate mitigation depends on the amount of suitable land available, the carbon accumulation rates achievable on different site types, and the permanence of carbon storage in restored forests. Estimates of the carbon sequestration potential of tropical forest restoration vary widely depending on assumptions about available land, baseline scenarios, and achievable carbon accumulation rates, with some studies projecting that tropical forest restoration could contribute meaningfully to limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, while others emphasize that restoration cannot substitute for emissions reductions and that unrealistic expectations about forest-based carbon sequestration could distract from more fundamental mitigation needs. The Bond Challenge, launched in 2011, established a global goal of restoring 150 million hectares of degraded and deforested land by 2020, later extended to 350 million hectares by 2030, though definitions of restoration in these commitments have been criticised for including tree plantations with limited biodiversity or ecosystem function, alongside ecological restoration of native forests. Indigenous peoples and local communities inhabit significant portions of the world's remaining tropical forests and possess knowledge, institutions and practices relevant to forest conservation and sustainable use that have been increasingly recognised in international policy frameworks. The territories formally recognised as belonging to Indigenous peoples cover approximately 28% of the world's land surface and an even larger share of the least disturbed remaining forests, and evidence from multiple regions suggests that forests under Indigenous management often maintain lower deforestation rates and higher carbon stocks than forests under other management regimes. However, Indigenous and community land rights remain insecure in many tropical forest countries, with formal legal recognition often incomplete or contested, and with on-the-ground enforcement inadequate to prevent encroachment, illegal logging, or violent conflict. The strengthening of Indigenous land rights represents both an ethical imperative, given the historical injustices experienced by Indigenous peoples, and a potentially effective conservation strategy, though realising this potential requires addressing the power imbalances, institutional weaknesses, and economic pressures that have undermined Indigenous tenure security. The commercialisation of forest products by Indigenous and local communities has been pursued as an approach to generating income compatible with forest conservation, based on the premise that if forests generate economic value for their inhabitants, those inhabitants will have incentives to maintain forest cover rather than converting it to other uses. Non-timber forest products including Brazil nuts, natural rubber, various fruits and palm products, medicinal plants, and handicrafts have supported community livelihoods and demonstrated that forests can generate economic returns without clear-cutting, though the scale of income generated by most extractive activities remains modest compared to the returns from agricultural conversion and highly variable depending on market conditions and access. The expansion of markets for forest products, whether through certification schemes that command price premiums, fair trade arrangements, or direct marketing to conservation-minded consumers, can improve returns to extractors, but also risks creating incentives for overharvest or for conversion of forest to more intensive production of valued species. The governance of tropical forests involves overlapping jurisdictions and competing interests that create complexity and often conflict at multiple scales. National governments typically hold legal authority over forest resources and establish the policies, laws, and institutions that shape forest outcomes, but their capacity and willingness to enforce forest protection varies enormously across countries and over time within the same country. Subnational governments at provincial, state, or municipal levels often hold substantial practical authority over land use decisions and may pursue policies that either reinforce or undermine national-level forest conservation goals. International institutions, agreements, and initiatives influence tropical forest governance through financing, technical assistance, diplomatic pressure, and the establishment of norms and standards, but lack direct authority to compel national or local compliance with forest protection measures. The effectiveness of forest governance depends not only on formal laws and policies, but also on informal norms, the distribution of power among stakeholders, the capacity of enforcement agencies, and the broader political and economic context in which decisions are made. Corruption can undermine even well-designed policies when enforcement officials can be bribed to overlook illegal activities, or when politically connected actors operate outside the law with impunity. Weak land tenure systems create ambiguity about who holds rights to forest land and resources, potentially encouraging land grabbing and preemptive clearing by those seeking to establish claims before others do. The decentralisation of forest management authority from national to local levels has produced mixed results, sometimes empowering local stakeholders who have greater knowledge of and stake in local forest conditions, but sometimes transferring authority to local elites who capture the benefits of forest exploitation while externalising the costs. The scientific understanding of tropical rainforests has developed through a complex history of exploration, collection, classification, and analysis that reflects the changing interests, technologies, and institutional arrangements of different eras. European naturalists of the 18th and 19th centuries undertook expeditions that produced foundational collections and descriptions of tropical organisms, but their work occurred within colonial power structures that extracted both specimens and knowledge from tropical regions to metropolitan centres. The legacy of this colonial history includes the concentration of major natural history collections in European and North American institutions, persistent inequalities in scientific capacity between tropical and temperate countries, and ongoing debates about the ownership and control of biological resources and traditional knowledge. Efforts to address these imbalances include the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing adopted in 2010, which establishes principles for the fair sharing of benefits arising from the use of genetic resources, and various capacity-building initiatives intended to strengthen scientific institutions in tropical countries. The technological capabilities available for studying tropical forests have expanded enormously in recent decades, from satellite remote sensing systems that can detect deforestation within days of its occurrence, to camera traps that continuously monitor animal populations at thousands of locations, to acoustic monitoring networks that record soundscapes and enable tracking of biodiversity trends through analysis of the acoustic signatures of vocalizing species. These technologies generate data at unprecedented volumes, creating opportunities for more comprehensive monitoring, but also challenges in data management, analysis, and interpretation. Machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches have been increasingly applied to tropical forest research, automating the identification of species from images or sounds, detecting patterns in large remote sensing datasets, and enabling predictions about forest dynamics under different scenarios. However, the development of these computational approaches requires training data and validation that depend on field observations by researchers with deep knowledge of tropical forest organisms and systems, highlighting the continued importance of field ecology and taxonomy, alongside technological innovation. The future of tropical rainforests will be shaped by decisions made over the coming decades regarding land use, climate change mitigation, conservation investment, and the recognition of indigenous and community rights. The trajectories that appear possible range from continued degradation and loss toward a world with substantially less tropical forest than exists today, to stabilization and even recovery if the drivers of deforestation can be addressed and the conditions for forest persistence maintained. The consequences of different trajectories extend far beyond the tropical regions themselves, given the global significance of tropical forests for climate regulation, biodiversity conservation, and the provision of ecosystem services that benefit populations worldwide. The choices facing tropical forest countries, and the international community more broadly, involve trade-offs among competing objectives and uncertainties about both the consequences of different actions and the responses of forest ecosystems to the interacting pressures they face. Understanding these choices and the complex histories, processes, and mechanisms that have produced the current situation provides the foundation for informed engagement with one of the most consequential environmental challenges of the present century. The accumulation of scientific knowledge about tropical rainforests over the past 2 centuries has revealed patterns and processes that were invisible to earlier observers, while also exposing the limits of current understanding. Each new discovery tends to reveal further questions, whether about the evolutionary origins of tropical diversity, the mechanisms that maintain species coexistence, the functioning of ecological networks, or the responses of forest ecosystems to novel conditions created by human activities and climate change. This characteristic of scientific progress, in which advancing knowledge reveals the extent of remaining ignorance, applies with particular force to tropical forests given their complexity, their diversity, and the practical difficulties of research in remote and challenging environments. The recognition that tropical forests remain incompletely known, even as they face accelerating pressures that threaten their continued existence in something like their current form, creates urgency around both conservation action and continued research to inform that action. The integration of local and traditional knowledge with scientific research represents an emerging frontier that could expand understanding of tropical forests, while also supporting the rights and livelihoods of forest-dependent peoples. Indigenous and local communities possess knowledge accumulated over generations about the properties and uses of forest plants and animals the seasonal patterns and ecological relationships that structure forest systems, and the indicators that signal changes in forest condition. This knowledge has typically not been recognised or valued by formal scientific institutions, but growing appreciation of its potential contributions has led to increased efforts at collaborative research that brings together different knowledge systems. However, realising this potential requires addressing the power imbalances that have historically characterised relationships between researchers and Indigenous communities, ensuring that communities maintain control over their knowledge and share in any benefits arising from its use, and developing research methods that respectfully integrate different ways of knowing, rather than simply extracting information for use within conventional scientific frameworks. The interrelationships among tropical forests, climate, biodiversity, and human societies create feedback loops and interactions that make it difficult to address any single aspect in isolation. Efforts to reduce deforestation that ignore the livelihood needs of forest-dependent populations may fail because they do not address the underlying drivers of forest conversion. Climate mitigation strategies that rely heavily on forest carbon sequestration may prove counterproductive if they lead to large-scale plantations that replace diverse native forests or displace local communities from their lands. Conservation approaches that exclude local people from forest areas may generate resentment and opposition that ultimately undermines conservation effectiveness. The recognition of these interconnections has led to increasing emphasis on integrated approaches that seek to address multiple objectives simultaneously, though implementing such approaches in practice involves navigating complex trade-offs and reconciling different stakeholder interests that may conflict in specific situations. The economic valuation of ecosystem services provided by tropical forests has attracted substantial attention as a potential tool for making the case for forest conservation in terms that resonate with decision-makers accustomed to cost-benefit analysis. Attempts to quantify the monetary value of services including carbon storage, water regulation, pollination, and biodiversity conservation have produced estimates suggesting that the total value of services provided by tropical forests exceeds by large margins the value that would be generated by converting them to alternative land uses. However, these valuations face methodological challenges, including the difficulty of assigning prices to services that are not traded in markets, the aggregation of values across services that may not be additive, and the risk that expressing forest value in monetary terms may undermine rather than support ethical arguments for conservation by implying that forests merit protection only when they generate positive returns on investment. The translation of theoretical ecosystem service values into actual financial flows that reach those who make land use decisions remains a major gap between the conceptual appeal of the ecosystem services framework and its practical application. The role of tropical forests in cultural, spiritual, and aesthetic dimensions of human experience extends beyond instrumental values that can be captured in the economic calculations. For Indigenous peoples, whose identities, cosmologies, and ways of life are intimately connected to particular forest places and species, the loss of forests represents not only material deprivation, but also cultural and spiritual harm that economic compensation cannot adequately address. For people throughout the world who may never visit tropical forests but value their existence, and the knowledge that they persist with their extraordinary diversity of life, forest loss diminishes the richness of the world even in the absence of direct personal impact. These non-material values resist quantification but are no less real for being difficult to measure, and their recognition implies that decisions about tropical forests raise ethical and political questions that cannot be resolved through technical or economic analysis alone. The construction of knowledge about tropical rainforests involves not only the collection and analysis of data, but also decisions about what questions to ask, what phenomena to notice, what explanatory frameworks to employ, and what interpretations to advance as conclusions. These decisions are never neutral or purely determined by the phenomena themselves, but reflect the interests, assumptions, and worldviews of those who make them. The history of tropical forest science includes periods when racial and cultural biases shaped interpretations of Indigenous peoples and their relationships to forest environments, when economic interests influenced what aspects of forests received attention and how their value was understood, and when the perspectives of researchers from metropolitan centres dominated the production of knowledge about tropical regions, where they held no particular expertise beyond that gained through relatively brief expeditions. Awareness of these dynamics does not invalidate the knowledge that scientific research has produced, but does suggest the importance of reflexivity about the conditions under which knowledge is produced and the interest it may serve. The transmission of scientific knowledge about tropical forests to broader publics occurs through channels that shape how information is received and understood. Popular accounts of tropical forests have often emphasized the spectacular, the exotic, and the threatened, presenting forests as sites of wonder, adventure, or looming catastrophe in ways that may or may not accurately convey scientific understanding. The framing of tropical deforestation as crisis may motivate concern and action, but can also foster fatalism if the problem appears too overwhelming to address, or may distort priorities by highlighting dramatic losses while neglecting the slower but consequential changes occurring in forests that remain nominally intact. The communication of uncertainty in scientific conclusions poses particular challenges, as acknowledging what is not known can be interpreted as license for inaction by those inclined to discount warnings about environmental threats, while also being essential for honest representation of the state of knowledge. The temporal scales relevant to tropical forest dynamics span from the rapid processes of individual tree mortality and gap formation that occur within days or weeks, to the successional processes by which forest composition changes over decades and centuries, to the evolutionary processes that have generated tropical diversity over millions of years. Fully understanding tropical forests requires holding these multiple timescales in view simultaneously, recognizing that the forests we observe today represent moments in ongoing processes of change that extend far beyond human lifespans or historical memory. The imposition of human timescales and the demands of policy cycles onto natural systems with fundamentally different temporal dynamics creates challenges for forest management and conservation, as the consequences of current actions may not become apparent for decades or centuries, and the short-term incentives facing decision-makers often diverge from what would be optimal over longer time frames. The spatial scales of tropical forest processes similarly range from the microhabitat conditions that determine whether an individual seed germinates and survives, to the landscape patterns of forest fragmentation and connectivity that influence population persistence and species dispersal, to the continental and global scales at which climate processes and biogeochemical cycles operate. Research at any single scale provides an incomplete picture, and the interactions across scales often produce emergent properties that are not predictable from understanding of any scale in isolation. The challenge of multi-scale understanding applies both to scientific research and to policy and management, as interventions at one scale may have consequences at others that are difficult to anticipate and may undermine intended outcomes. The institutional arrangements through which tropical forests are governed reflect historical developments, political configurations, and contested claims to authority that vary across countries and regions. The concept of state ownership of forest resources, which prevails in most tropical countries, derives from colonial-era appropriation of lands and resources that had previously been held under diverse indigenous tenure systems, and continues to structure the distribution of rights and benefits from forest use in ways that often disadvantage local populations. Attempts to reform forest governance face resistance from established interests that benefit from current arrangements and must navigate complex relationships among national governments, local authorities, private sector actors, civil society organizations, and international institutions with different and often conflicting objectives. The pace and direction of institutional change in forest governance will significantly influence the trajectory of tropical forests in the coming decades, though predicting the course of institutional change proves at least as difficult as predicting ecological or climatic change. The study of tropical rainforests provides a lens through which to examine broader questions about humanity's relationship with the natural world, the construction of scientific knowledge, the dynamics of global environmental change, and the possibilities for sustainable development. The answers to these questions cannot be read directly from the accumulated facts about tropical forests, but require interpretation, judgment, and choices that are inevitably influenced by values and interests. The persistence of tropical rainforests in something like their current form is not guaranteed, but depends on decisions that will be made by billions of people, acting individually and collectively, in full knowledge of the consequences, or in ignorance, with immediate concerns or with long-term perspectives, within institutional structures that enable or constrain different outcomes. The depth and rigor of understanding about tropical forests shapes the context in which these decisions are made and the possibilities for choices that sustain both human and non-human flourishing, though understanding alone cannot determine what choices will be made or ensure that they will prove wise.